evening. I'm sure you'll all forgive me for sitting down for this sciatica. If any of you have ever had it, I feel sorry for you, and I hope you now feel sorry for me. So, it was a great week. Millicent Fawcett. If you haven't seen her in Parliament Square yet, please do go along, because it's the most beautiful sculpture in the square, and she was very, very important for winning the vote for women. And she is, by the way, in my book. Of course she is. It was Thomas Carlyle in 1840, around 1840, who said, "The history of the world is but the history of great men." And I suppose, born in 1950, that's what I was taught. And it was only when my education started to improve that I discovered that actually there were lots of women who deserved to be considered part of the history, certainly of this country, and then my next book will be about women in the history of the world. But I started the book really because in 2015 it was decided that women's history, suffragettes, feminism would be removed from the A-level history course. And I thought, what? And then somebody suggested, oh, well, we could keep the suffragettes in, I suppose. They could be a kind of pressure group, a pressure group that actually, with the suffragists, won the vote for women, which was so important. So I thought, no, I've got to do something about this. So I started with Boadicea. It runs from, and yes, I do call her Boadicea. Some of you are young enough, probably, to have been told she was really called Boadicea, but I think that is such an ugly name. So I was taught Boadicea when I was at school, and I stuck with Boadicea. And I first encountered her. I come from Barnsley in Yorkshire. And when I passed my 11 plus, as you had to do in those days, you had to take the 11 plus, my dad said, come on, we'll take you down to London and show you around. And we went all over the city, and there was Lord this, and Sir that, and Duke the other, and King whatever. And I started to get a bit bored, even at the age of 11. And then suddenly we came down to the embankment, and I'm very fond of horses, always have been. And there was this incredible statue of these horses rearing up. Behind them, a chariot, and a woman standing with a spear in complete control of these horses. And behind her, two other young women. And I said to my dad, Dad, who's that? And he said, oh, it says here, Boadicea. And he didn't know very much about her. So I then started to learn about her. And it's really only as an adult that I've really learned how important she was and how important she could have been had it not been for those wretched Romans. Because Boadicea was queen of the Iceni, and her husband died. And she fully expected that she would inherit his crown and his lands and his money, and she would rule in his place. And the Romans said, no. Roman women do not inherit power or money or land. And she was severely beaten. And then her two daughters, the two young women who are at the back of that Thornycroft statue, were handed over to a group of Roman soldiers, and they were raped, gang raped. So that seemed to me a rather good idea to take up arms against them when that had been done to you and your daughters, and you had been denied all the rights that you thought you were going to have. So, of course, she got all the tribes around, and they took on the most powerful army in the world. Of course, they didn't win. They did lay London to waste. London wasn't as big as it is now, obviously. And St Albans and Colchester, they make quite a mess of. But, of course, they lost. And when I look back on that period, and I think, okay, you know, if those Romans hadn't been here, we might not have had the straight roads that we've got, and we might not have had the habit of bathing that we now have. But what we might have had was sexual equality. Because in those tribes, the women and the men, the girls and the boys were taught to fight, were taught to rule, were educated, and it was expected that a woman would inherit from her husband. So I'm very sad that Boadicea died. Now, the next woman in the book with whom I have been obsessed since teenage, I saw her on that same trip, or I saw her burial place in Westminster Abbey, Elizabeth I. When people say, who would be your ideal dinner party guest, I always lead the list with Elizabeth I, because there are a number of questions I would really like to ask her. Number one is, how do you deal with a father who had your mother decapitated on the flimsiest evidence of adultery? That, of course, was Anne Boleyn. How did you rule? How did you choose the advisors around you so that you ran this country in relative peace for 40 years, and it was prosperous, and you were a very successful queen? And then the last question I really want to ask her is, virgin, really? I sort of would like to think she had a bit of fun with Leicester or Essex or one of those. Again, it was on this trip to London that I really discovered her. And what I found as I started to research more about where she's buried, in Westminster Abbey, there's a chapel. As you go up through, one of the side chapels has Elizabeth I and Mary Tudor in the same grave. How bizarre. Half-sisters who absolutely hated each other, couldn't agree for a second on anything, especially religion. And then on the other side of the same chapel, in a much grander burial place, is Mary, Queen of Scots. How odd, I thought, even as a child, that these two women, the one who had the other decapitated, should lie virtually alongside each other forever. And then on the wall, there's the facsimile of a letter which was sent by James VI of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots' son, James I of England, who inherited Elizabeth's crown, and it says, will the people of Peterborough please exhume his mother and carry her to London and bury her in Westminster Abbey with the pomp and circumstance that was due to a queen. So I remember thinking, oh, that's quite nice. You know, a son does that, wants his mum brought down to London. And then when I started to research why these women were placed where they were placed, James I did a lot of renovation work in Westminster Abbey when he came to the throne. And Elizabeth had originally been buried in the chapel of Henry VII, her grandfather. And James had her moved and taken away from the place that would have said, yes, this woman definitely had the right to inherit the crown, and brought her along with Mary and put the two of them together in the same grave, and then put his mother alongside them. And when you draw a line from the chapel of Henry VII down to Elizabeth I and Mary Tudor, you see there are no other women in that line who bore children. And then you look at Mary, Queen of Scots, and you draw a line up to Henry VII from where she is buried, and that's where all the women in the line who had children are. So James was saying to history, these women inherited, they shouldn't have. My mother should have inherited the crown because she was the one who deserved it, and she bore a child. And I do say at the end of the chapter that in the 21st century, at least, we should be able to value a woman for what she achieves and not merely her ability to bear children. In the book, I have tried to include the suffragists, the suffragettes, and then Ethel Smile, who is a composer. And her most famous piece of work, The March of the Women, was sung on Tuesday morning at the unveiling of Millicent Fawcett. And she was a really interesting composer. She was really very, very talented at a time when it was very, very difficult to become a composer if you were a woman. And as a girl, she had played cricket with her brothers and had learned to bowl over arm, which was, again, quite unusual for a girl in that period. And then when she came to London and started putting on operas and getting her music performed, she met one Emmeline Pankhurst, who was the leader of the suffragette movement. And they were having a conversation one day, and Emmeline said, "Did you say you used to play cricket with your brothers when you were little?" And Ethel said, "Yeah, that's true." She said, "Oh, it's just, did you actually learn to bowl over arm?" And she said, "Yeah, of course, I was very good at it." "Great," said Emmeline. "In that case, would you please teach the rest of us how effectively to throw bricks and stones through windows so that we can make an impact on this suffrage movement?" So Ethel, of course, ended up in Holloway as a result of her activities with the suffragettes. And her cell and the bars of her cell looked out over the little circle in front of Holloway, which tragically is no more. I mean, how we could have let so much women's history just go from London, I don't know. It really annoys me, but we have. But there she was in her cell, and a little group of suffragettes came and they sang the March of the Women, and Ethel stuck her arm with her toothbrush through the bars of her cell, and she conducted them. And finally, I'm not a woman who gets scared. Only one woman who's in my book scared me. Any guesses who it might have been? Yeah, Margaret Thatcher. She used to fix me with these blue eyes, and you always knew she just wanted to tear you limb from limb if you got anything wrong. But one of the things I always wanted to know was, what was it like being the woman prime minister when your gender was consistently referred to? And she would always say, "Oh, Jenny, I'm not a woman prime minister, I'm the prime minister." And then, after she was deposed, it was my misfortune to have to read through what was probably the most boring autobiography I've ever had to read, hers, trying to find some sort of indication of this. And she did give me one. She said when she first met her cabinet, who were the great Tory grandees, they had treated her as if she were the cleaning lady. And I thought, there we are, there's my in. And she agreed to come into the studio rather than me having to go to 10 Downing Street, because obviously she wasn't there anymore. And so I put together this question. I asked her about the grandees and the cleaning lady. I asked her how she dealt with people always saying she gave somebody naughty a handbagging. Nobody ever says a man has given somebody a briefcasing, do they? That Alan Clark had referred in his diaries to her finely turned ankles and how much he'd fancied her during Prime Minister's questions. And that President Mitterrand had described her as having the eyes of Caligula and the lips of Marilyn Monroe. And she said nothing. And so I rapidly had to think of another question. I will be one more second. And the reviewer, the radio reviewer in the Sunday Times the following weekend said he'd listened with interest to the interview with Baroness Thatcher, and it was the only time ever his radio had frozen over. So I suppose I do have the distinction of having been the only journalist ever to silence Margaret Thatcher. Thank you.